Hey everybody, I'm Rob Childs, a Rapier swordsman out of the United States, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a technique that I use called the backsnapping beat. Before I get to that, however, to explain why you're not seeing my regular rapier in my hand, this is the Siggy Forge cup hilt rapier. They have sent this to me in order to do a review, so keep your eyes on this channel later on because you'll see that review video later on. Before we get started though, I want to make sure that I put a shout out to my 5 new Patreon supporters that have signed on most recently. Just wanted to say thank you very much for signing on to the Castle Project. You guys are making a huge impact. You take a lot of small donations and you add them all together at the same time, and those small donations make for a really big effect. And you guys are having that kind of effect right now. So again, thanks to you new Patreon supporters, and I look forward to seeing you at the Castle property soon. A student that I'm currently teaching had a revelation of his own, if you will, and that was about the way that I hold the rapier that enables me to do such powerful beating actions from the low guard into these upper areas, whether you're talking about the quadrant of 4 or the quadrant of 6, whatever the case is. He's been fencing for decades himself, didn't realize that I actually did this, so I'm going to share that with all of you so that way you have an understanding and perhaps could even incorporate it into your own style of fence if you so choose. So the backsnapping beat is one that I use from a low guard. Now, when I'm fencing, anybody who's ever seen me before will recognize that I always, unlike others, from mid guard or high guard, I always fence from a low guard position. But when someone makes a thrusting attack or whatever, if they're doing a cut, whatever the case is, I am able to quickly raise up my sword in order to strike their weapon and send it away from me, and allows me to do whatever it is I wish to do next. Now, that snapping action is not an accident, and normally, when someone tries to go from a low position with their sword to a high position with their sword, it usually does not happen all at once, meaning the arm, the hand, and the sword do not all arrive in their positions at the same time, because it usually turns into a kind of waving motion, where they start pulling up on the arm, and then the sword gets up into the space. The arm will get to its position first, and then the wrist has flexed, and then the sword arrives as well. All of that is a very slow wave motion that doesn't allow for a whole lot of protection when you're talking about the fractions of a second with which fencing happens. So I also encountered this when I first started fencing from that low guard position, and I wanted to have that strong defense no matter what it was that I was doing. So I realized I could get that if I just simply created a lever. And by that, with my sword, I will take the pommel of that weapon, and in my low guard position, I will wedge that underneath and up against the inside of my wrist. Now, when I'm in a low guard position, that pommel is now wedged against the inside of my wrist, and when I pull up on my arm, that pommel is pressed against the inside of my wrist, and it will ensure the entire weapon rises up and lands in its proper position in the same timing as the rest of my arm, my wrist, the cup, everything. Important, however, when you do this, do not allow your wrist to flex on the way up, and do not allow it to flex after the sword's arrival, meaning do not allow that pommel to slip to the side and allow that sword to wave. Keep that pommel wedged against the inside, and when you finally do get to that proper position in the upper quadrant, do not allow your sword to continue flexing past that point, because you're going to create those broken lines, those openings, those areas that allows your opponent to be able to sneak that point in there and get that thrust or get that cut, get that slice, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure that you are presenting a solid line of defense. So again, when you are doing this backsnapping beat, you can pretend that your opponent is thrusting at you, and then with that proper step back, of course, to buy yourself the proper amount of time, you're going to make sure that you raise the sword up, the whole arm, all of the sword, in a straight line, all arrives at the same time. When you do this, you are minimizing the amount of time it takes for you to get that defense in place. It creates a very powerful defense against your opponent. And as you're about to see, if you wish, you can actually use this parry as a striking motion against your opponent's weapon to beat that opposing weapon away from you and allow you to do, well, any number of things. Just like this. There is one more piece of information that is important to keep in mind while you're executing a backsnapping beat, and that is, like any other beat that you are delivering, it needs to be done with the edge of your weapon. If your sword rises up with the flat, as opposed to, as if you were cutting the air with your rapier, as opposed to just simply passing through it, right? You are moving in relation to the edges of your sword. If you strike your opponent's weapon and you do so with the flat of your weapon, just simply raising your sword and striking with the flat, you're going to lose a lot of that momentum force that would have been transferred into your opponent's weapon, because as you are rising, your sword will bend on the way up and you'll lose some of that force that you would have projected into your opponent's weapon. You'll lose some of that force when you strike your opponent with the flat of the weapon because your sword will bend around it. You're not going to get that maximum transfer of force. So when you deliver the backsnapping beat, make sure that it is done with the edge of your sword. Your sword does not bend from edge to edge. That direction is just not possible for your weapon, which means when you strike the opposing blade, you're going to transfer the maximum amount of force, which means you're going to get the maximum amount of deflection. The last thing that I will leave you with is that there is a very important piece of information that you have to make sure that you are also executing when you do this technique in order to make sure that you are doing it to the maximal effect. And that is where you strike your opponent's weapon. As everybody knows, or at least anybody who's been fencing for a little while knows, that there is a weak part of the sword and there is a strong part of the sword. When your opponent reaches out to you with their weapon, if you're going to perform this backsnapping beat, where you strike that sword is going to have a great deal of influence over how much distance, how much power you're able to put into that opposing weapon. So think of it kind of like a pitcher and a batter, right? For those of you in the States, you understand the game of baseball. When that pitcher throws that ball, it's up to the batter to be able to get that precise location, that strike against the ball in order to maximize the distance they can put into it. Same thing goes here. When your opponent extends that sword toward you, that is the pitch. You, as the opposing swordsman, the batter, if you will, has to make sure that when you strike, you are utilizing, if you can, right around where that foible meso transition area on your sword. If you utilize that and strike the opposing sword in relatively the same area where that foible meso transition area is, you will transfer the maximum amount of power that you generated into the opposing weapon, sending it on its merry way, and also ensuring you have the maximum amount of time to do your follow-on strike or whatever it is that you intended to do after that point. So again, make sure that you wedge the pommel up against the inside of the arm. You have that pressed against there. Make sure that you maintain that straight line. And then when you rise up, don't let that wrist break at the last minute. That burns up unnecessary time. So pommel against the wrist. And when you execute that backsnapping beat, make sure that the foible transition of your sword strikes against the foible transition of your opposing sword. You do that, you're well on your way to making this a most effective addition to your repertoire.